Methodologies weren't necessarily overly sophisticated. Climate change was definitely factored in. Sea level rise was one of the primary factors that received generous consideration through this bridge. So I'm getting now to the results of the National Survey of Infrastructure Engineers that was carried out about a year ago by the Canadian Standards Association. The intent of the survey was threefold. To measure the baseline for, and I'll just read off here, the current level of awareness of selected issues related to climate change, the practicing infrastructure engineer's perspective on needs and priorities for addressing climate change issues, and implications for university engineering curricula aimed at infrastructure engineers. What you're going to see in the way of results in the next slides basically tells us that while there's a growing awareness among infrastructure practitioners of the challenges that will be posed by climate change, knowledge for how to respond is really just in its infancy. So this is just a quick look at numbers of respondents, pretty good distribution across the various infrastructure categories: water infrastructure, transportation, energy, and buildings and other. And what this first graph shows is that nationally, more than 4 in 5 engineers accept that climate change indeed will affect their practice over the years to come. All 4 practitioners in all 4 categories felt this way, but water and building categories were statistically more predisposed to the idea that climate change will affect their decisions compared to when we lump all the categories together. Almost 3 out of 4 respondents claim to need more information on climate change in order to incorporate climate change risk factors into their work. Almost half of water infrastructure engineers believe strongly that they need more information. So then, one of the questions asked of the engineers was related to their level of familiarity with a range of potential impacts associated with climate change. And more than half of respondents indicated that they were at least somewhat familiar with the expected impacts. The highest level of familiarity related to impacts due to weather versus, for example, indirect impacts, long-term or cumulative impacts. And fewer than 1 in 3 engineers maintain that they are very familiar with expected impacts. So while there appears to be good general awareness, there's also a knowledge gap, because engineers really probably do need to be very familiar with climate change impacts if they're to use this knowledge in their practice. Next, respondents were asked about their level of familiarity with adaptation options. Transportation engineers reported the lowest level of strong familiarity with proposed solutions. Energy and water engineers seem more strongly familiar with risk-based and contingency solutions. But on the whole, what the results indicate is that there's a significant gap between what engineers say they know and what they would need to know in order to deal with climate change issues. So there's a definite need for education. As part of the survey, the respondents were also asked to make recommendations in relation to climate change adaptation for training models that would be valuable to them in their practice. And they were provided a list and asked to rank various options by level of importance, complexity of the topic, engineering disciplines that should have an interest, etc. This example here is one that relates specifically to building in permafrost situations, and just as an example. So far in Canada, and probably in most developed countries, engagement with the whole issue of adaptation has really been mostly at the government level. The adaptation imperative, to call it, that has really not been well enough translated down to people with responsibilities at the operational level, infrastructure practitioners, etc. And at the same time, though, this is changing. As the survey helped to indicate, both private and public sector organizations are increasingly aware that they need practical tools to help them in managing climate change related risks. Of course, along with everything else that they have to manage, as we've heard. And so it's with this in mind that the Canadian Standards Association is looking very seriously at striking a technical committee for the development of a national climate change risk management standard and an associated technical annex. And the intent would be to allow organizations to assess the risks associated with climate change to facilities supporting infrastructure, operations, products, and services, and to manage the risks and vulnerabilities by defining and executing appropriate response measures. I should really mention here that already a good amount of very good work along these lines has occurred. PIVC, Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee, was mentioned already. Bruce, Egner, and Noble, three authors, authored one paper and then one kind of risk-based guide for municipal decision-making relating to climate change impacts in Ontario. The Canadian Standards Association itself has a national risk management standard. The idea for a national climate change risk management standard is that it will build upon all these efforts that have happened to date and help to normalize approaches at the national level. And that in some respects it also intends to go further than what's been done so far, that it'll probably have a stronger emphasis on the identification of adaptation solutions and related monitoring and reporting protocols. The other thing that the standard simply has to do, if it wants to be of use, we think, to decision makers at the local level, is to be compatible with existing management systems, such as the ISO 1400 family of standards on environmental management, ISO 9000 on quality management, and the new ISO 3100 on enterprise risk management. So while the standard itself will walk through kind of the process of climate change risk management, the technical annex is meant to provide a link to technical information for successfully implementing the standard. And so the vision for that at this point is a technical annex that would deliver information by region, by infrastructure category, economic sector, by product and service, and furthermore, this kind of document should really, will by necessity need to be a living document. So this slide relates to the first section of that annex, which is focused on the impacts. There would be two other sections of the technical annex as well. One that would provide information and direction regarding the use of particular risk and vulnerability assessment tools. And then the other that would look at how to go about choosing, implementing, and monitoring specific adaptation measures. So I'm moving here on to conclusions. So just to wrap up, as far as CSRI are concerned, a number of things have to be done in order to ensure that that infrastructure practitioners consider climate change related risks in their practices. First of all, it would be a useful exercise to prioritize CSRI associated with categories of infrastructure that may be most at risk. This is an exercise that we think that a climate change risk management standard might also help out with. The upgrading of climate design values is obviously paramount, and we've heard a number of people speak to that today. And this may include the movement towards the inclusion of trends analysis and consideration of how to integrate forward-looking projections. It would also be useful to conduct an information needs assessment, and by this, we're thinking about an in-depth survey with planners, designers, builders, etc., asking questions like, which information do you most need, use, or wish you had? And that said, what are the priorities for the development of this new information? How should it be done? And then once the information is on hand, and this speaks a bit to the technical annex for the standard we have in mind, how do you actually deliver that information so that it's easily accessible for all parties that would require it? We also think that the development and implementation of learning strategies for relevant communities of practice are important. That's the module that I showed there on relating to permafrost. And more broadly, of course, we think it should be a priority to develop a standard on climate change risk management for Canada. So with that, to wrap up and leave it open for questions.